In the last episode, we were able to dig into the context and events that gave rise to the Cold War. In this episode, we're more going to talk about the Cold War itself. The Cold War lasted essentially from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As we discussed in the last episode, as World War II drew to a close, the ideological differences, mistrust, and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union imploded their wartime alliance. As the traditional Western powers and Japan plunged into rebuilding in the wake of the catastrophe of the war, they were in no shape to control the international narrative in the way that they had for the prior 100 years. Instead, a bipolar world emerged, with one magnetic end on the democratic capitalist United States and the other magnetic end, the totalitarian communist state of the Soviet Union. One of the defining attributes of the Cold War was its ideological struggle. These two competing narratives sought out allies, cronies, and puppet regimes all around the world. And we'll get more into that in the next episode. But I want to discuss why exactly these two ideologies and systems were incompatible, or at least were viewed by the other as such existential threats. Remember that capitalism needs markets and free trade to function. In order to maintain employment and consumer spending, the wheels of the capitalist engine have to keep turning by finding new customers and more efficient ways of doing business. Sometimes businesses and corporations are actually bigger and have more weight than individual nations. Think about how United Fruit was able to just throw its weight around and get the US government to do its bidding, or the role that American agriculturalists played in the overthrow of Queen Leleokalani in Hawaii, or the role of the British East India Company in India. Well, in the 20th century, transnational corporations were powerful entities, and the spread of communism was not in their favor. It limits their markets and their access to raw materials. Also remember that communism is an internationalist theory. It seeks to dissolve national borders to create a worldwide worker/proletariat paradise. So, if it were to spread, it would absorb these nations it spreads to and create one large worldwide union. So that's kind of a big existential threat. Now let's talk about Stalin's problem. So Stalin he definitely does create a police state in the Soviet Union. There was no free speech, no right to assemble, no access to international news or free journalism. The way he saw it, he'd worked hard to cleanse Russia of bourgeois trappings like consumer goods, fancy houses, art, and any other culture that doesn't seek to prop up the regime. We see a mass exodus of artists from the Soviet Union since they aren't actually able to make the art they want to make. Socialist realism, seen here in this very propagandistic painting, was declared the only acceptable form of art in 1934. Another example of this is from East Berlin, where attached to one of the ministry buildings in East Berlin, you could see this very socialist mural of all different types of people and all different workers. Here's my picture of it, coming together, and everyone is super happy. It also becomes the focal point of the 1953 uprising against the Soviet Union in East Germany and East Berlin. And there's a photograph in front of the mural now. Now it's like kind of just a memorial that has a photograph of people in this actual uprising. And here's another example of it as they roll tanks through the streets. So, right, the workers' paradise that is portrayed in these images of socialist realism, not really a thing. Because of these cultural differences, imagine it, right? The free speech hippies of the United States are basically the antithesis of anything you could find in the Soviet Union, where everything, including the buildings, are gray and utilitarian, because what do you need nice things for? You're not a capitalist pig. Except that people are human, and it turns out they actually do like nice things and having leisure activities that aren't geared towards just celebrating how great the socialist system is. But I digress. Overall, the Western system is a threat to Stalin's hold on power. Whether or not Stalin is a committed socialist is kind of beyond the point. Stalin's own creation kind of won't allow him to back down, loosen up, or engage. He lives in the world of strongman politics and has to create the image of Russia to match it. The reason I'm talking about this is because the West seeming, for the Soviets anyways, obsession with materialism, the seeming hypocrisy of their criticism of the Soviet Union when the majority of Black Americans couldn't vote, and the ability to protest the government's involvement in, say, Vietnam, were things that Stalin and Soviet leaders just could not afford. Meanwhile, the US took its new role on the world stage very seriously. After defeating the dictatorships of Germany, Italy, and Japan, crafting new constitutions for them, and occupying them to ensure the success of these new governments, they then invested heavily in the rebuilding of Western Europe with the Marshall Plan. If these countries then fell to communism, that investment in men, material, and means would all be for nothing. Furthermore, it would hurt the US's image as a beacon of democracy if it didn't protect these fledgling countries and ensure that they remained, well, friendly and democratic. Of course, those two things had to go together. The US was not about to invest in your country for you to turn your back on them. But some countries did. Rather than fit into this bipolar world, a new strand of mostly third world or newly independent nations chose what would become known as the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement emerged in the 1950s as newly independent nations in Africa and Asia sought to determine their own futures in such a hotly divided world. For many, the pressure to fall within the orbit of either the United States or the Soviet Union felt an awful lot like colonialism, but by another name. Instead, they wanted a middle path forward. So, in 1955, Indonesia's President Sukarno, here he is, here, a man with his own questionable legacy of possibly being a dictator, invited Asian and African heads of state to a conference in Bandung, Indonesia. It's called the Bandung Conference. There, leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, Kwame Nkrumah, the first President of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the second President of an independent Egypt, U Nu, the first Prime Minister of Burma, not pictured, and Joseph Tito, the dictator of Yugoslavia, were all present and signed a declaration stating the following 5 principles: mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Mostly, the goal was to band together to avoid this neo-imperialism by either the US or the USSR. Strangely, China kind of joined. They had observer status. And Tito was a communist revolutionary and basically a dictator, but the goal wasn't necessarily to choose one of the two systems. The goal was to not fall victim to the world's bipolarity and participate in the Cold War. The first official summit after this was held in 1961 in Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, hosted by Tito. Before the conference proper started, Tito hosted Jawaharlal Nehru and Gamal Abdel Nasser, and they called themselves the, quote, Third World Yalta. And according to the University of Virginia's Global South Studies Center, this naming and this conference was a direct response to the power politics played by the big dogs at the end of World War II. Obviously, that paraphrase is mine. While the conference and others that followed it did raise the status of the movement in relation to how they were viewed by the superpowers, it didn't raise their status enough to stop the USSR from resuming nuclear testing on the first day of the conference in 1961. A kind of passive-aggressive, or maybe more aggressive, comment on what they thought of the movement. As the movement evolved, one of its primary goals, which was actually outlined at the Havana Conference in 1979, was to ensure self-determination for their member states and any states that wanted it. In this way, it became forcefully opposed to colonialism and racism of any kind. The movement's purpose and continued existence had been called into question since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and now it just seems like a block of formerly dependent nations banding together, which they can already do without needing their own movement. Despite this, they have morphed some of their goals to be more focused on issues relevant to the 21st century. And so the legacy of the Cold War post-1991 still continues. And it's important to note that despite the overwhelming dominance of the two superpowers, that not everyone sought to fall into their orbit. That's all for today. Thanks so much for watching. And remember to like and subscribe so you never miss anything AP World History.